Welcome back to Emerson Middle School for the 2019-2020 year. Let's take a minute to refamiliarize us with Emerson's staff. This year, Mrs. Alimo is our principal, Mr. Banka is our assistant principal, and we welcome Mr. Majewski as our associate principal. Also in the office, we have Mrs. Karkazis, Mrs. Maza, and Mrs. Simonetti. Our school resource officer this year is Officer Regal from the Niles Police Department. This year's custodial staff is Mr. Calloway, Mr. Valentine, and Mr. Franz, as well as Mr. Bidney and Mr. Kearns. In the Student Services Department, we have Mrs. Bear, our Special Education Coordinator, Dr. McLean, our School Psychologist, Ms. Solano, our Behavioral Interventionist, Mrs. Rogers is our School Counselor, and then Mrs. Rice is one of our social workers. Mrs. Odell and Miss Glass are also two of our school's social workers. Additionally, with Student Services, we have Mrs. Condon as our physical therapist, Ms. Pawlowski as our occupational therapist, and Mrs. Flake as our speech therapist. And Mrs. Goss is our school nurse. In the Learning Resource Center, or the LRC, or the library, Mrs. Contreras is our library information specialist, and Mrs. Beauvais is our LRC assistant. Also in the library, you'll be able to find Miss Richter, our instructional technology coach, and Mr. Dan Pacurar, our district technologist. Mrs. Gomez and Mrs. Shaw are two of our school's interventionists. We also have Mrs. McGassey, Miss Donato, and Mrs. Zukis. In the special education department, we have Mrs. Hess, Mrs. McCarthy. As special education assistants, we have Mrs. Adamowski, Mrs. Andronikova, Mrs. Downing, Mrs. Halston, Mr. Kapelnick, Mrs. Levitt, and finally, Miss Kelly and Mrs. Byrne, and not pictured is Mr. Trudell. For CFC, we have Mrs. Fuzzikin for language arts, Mrs. Hutchinson for math, Miss Dominides for math, and Miss Apuli for language arts. In 6th grade, we have 3 teams, the Ravens, the Sugar Gliders, and the Fireflies. On the Ravens team, we have Mrs. Prokos teaching social studies, Miss Nguyen teaching language arts, Miss Winnick teaching science, Mr. Simmons teaching math, Mr. Gustafson in instructional resource, and Miss Travis as our instructional resource assistant. For the 6th grade Sugar Gliders, we have Miss Keim teaching social studies, Mrs. Naves teaching language arts, Mr. Keating teaching science, Mrs. Warnicki teaching math, and Mrs. Anderson as our instructional resource teacher, and Mrs. White as our instructional resource assistant. And finally, wrapping up 6th grade, we have in the Fireflies. We have Mrs. Zwick teaching social studies, Miss Pottinger teaching science, Mrs. Eichinger teaching math, and Miss Fuzzikin teaching LA as well. On 7th grade, we have 3 teams, the Flamingos, a team formerly known as the Banthas, and the Tasmanian Devils. So our first team of the Flamingos has Mrs. Loomis teaching social studies, Miss Harrington teaching language arts, Miss Fuller teaching science, Mrs. Deaton teaching math, Mrs. Len as our instructional resource teacher, and Mrs. Berry as our instructional resource assistant. Our second 7th grade team, who is still deciding on a team name, has Mr. Florence as the social studies teacher, Mrs. Sorensen teaches language arts, Mrs. Mergis teaches science, Mrs. Jones teaches math, and Mrs. Koberger teaches instructional resource, and Mrs. Aiello is the instructional resource assistant. Our final 7th grade team, the Tasmanian Devils, has Mrs. Russell teaching language arts, Mr. Shangrati teaching science, and Mrs. Majori teaching math. Our 8th grade teams, the Panthers, the Bulldogs, and the Antelopes. The Panthers have Mrs. Flores teaching social studies, Miss Hrabsky teaching language arts, Miss John teaching science, Mrs. Kaplis teaching math, and then Mrs. Peckick as the instructional resource teacher, and Mrs. San Gambino as our instructional resource assistant. For the Bulldogs, we have Mr. Schalke teaching social studies, Miss Sweeney teaching language arts, we have Miss Swain teaching science, we have Mrs. Behoff teaching math, Mrs. Bard is our instructional resource teacher, and Miss Miller is our instructional resource assistant. And our final 8th grade team is the Antelopes, with Mr. Lawson teaching language arts, Mr. Brinio teaching science, and Mr. Spielberg teaching math. The PE department is made up of Miss Van Horn, Miss Pager, Mrs. Nelson, Mr. Schauer, Mr. D'Amano, and Mr. Alvarez. The art department this year is made up of Mr. Pearl, Mrs. Dietzick, and Mr. Marks. In the foreign language department, we have Mr. Hammer, Mr. Hobson, and Mrs. Zaski all teaching Spanish. Mrs. Timperley teaches French, and Mrs. London and Miss Hernandez also teach Spanish. The music department is made up of Mrs. Broker, Mr. Kennedy, and Mrs. Kwasny. The instrumental music department is made up of Mrs. Fallhaber and Miss Keem for orchestra, and Mr. Bachman and Mr. Teeter for band. The industrial technology department is made up of Mr. Senf and Mr. Lydell. The family and consumer science department, or the FACS department, is made up of Mrs. Golbeck and Mrs. Tenura. The health department is made up of Mrs. Schumacher and Miss Newmer. And finally, the technology department is Miss Corsello. Welcome back to the 2019 school year, and remember, an Emerson Eagle soars.